Morning, guys. Happy New Year, everyone. How are we feeling, guys? Happy New Year. It's 2026. Isn't that amazing? Can you believe it's the new year already? I'm talking about plans later this year, and I'm still referring to as next year, talking about plans. So I'm still somewhere in mid-December at the moment, trying to arrive in 2026. We had an amazing New Year's Eve party right here. So if you were there, it was incredible. How amazing was that party, everybody who was there? Woo! It was really fun. Marius and Adina did an incredible job with their team. Let's put their hands together. I mean, they really put their effort into that party. Marius was inflating giant balloons with the breath of his own lungs into these huge balloons. The effort that went into that was amazing, and Marius did a fantastic job, so thank you for that. And then we went and we had a live stream of the London fireworks, which was pretty amazing. And then we went out the door and had a live view of the Reading fireworks, apparently, because there were fireworks everywhere. I love free fire. You never have to buy fireworks, do you? You can just go stand in an urban setting and enjoy them. I don't know. I've never actually had to buy fireworks. But it's exciting to kind of be at the start of a new year. But it's also kind of disorienting. Like I said, I'm still catching up with myself. But one of the things I do which helps orient myself is at the end of every year, I've been doing this for about 15 years now, I take about 2 or 3 hours, I go to a coffee shop, I sit down and I make kind of a reflection of the past year. And I look back and I think about ways that God has answered prayers. I think about some of the things I've learned across the year. And it's a really helpful exercise. And I have this kind of folder going back to 2011, 2012. And sometimes I go back and read, what was I thinking as a 20-year-old at the end of that year? And it's quite amazing, actually, to see that God has actually been fulfilling some of these desires and prayers, sometimes 10, 15 years later. But, time is passing by so quickly, and sometimes we just need that kind of space to stop and look back and orient ourselves, because we're always looking ahead, aren't we? We're always, what's next? When's the next thing coming? And so that's an exercise that I find really helpful for me personally. But also as a church, right, as a collective, as a group, it's great to look back on the past year and really reflect and think, wow, look at what God has done in 2025. We had this theme of connection, and I think as a church, we've become more connected. I'm not just saying that because that was the theme. I'm saying that because that's what I've observed. I really feel like, we've grown more connected. We moved to this school in sort of March of last year. And I think God has blessed that in different ways. People coming from Reading itself, but also the ability to kind of connect with the university and create kind of a student community just because we're so close to the university now. But that's been great. And I think looking ahead this year, the theme is add to your faith. We've built connection in the past year. We're not forgetting about connecting. We're going to build and deepen that connection as we go into this new year. We started small groups in 2025, and we're going to keep working on helping our small groups to function, to work, to grow deeper, right? But this idea of add to our faith, what does that mean? Well, when I think of our vision as a church, and we've said this in different ways across the past year or so, but here's kind of broadly our vision for Thames Valley. To be a people united in their love for God, their apprenticeship to Jesus, and in a commitment to see families and communities transformed by the gospel. We want to be a church where everyone knows their gifts and is using them for the kingdom of God, right? That's what we desire to be as a church. That's why we've been connecting. That's why we've been forming small groups. That's why we need to add to our faith. We need to work on our faith and build our faith this year. And so I'm going to explain a little bit more about what it means to add to our faith today. But it comes from 2 Peter 1. That's our theme sort of passage. And so if we turn to 2 Peter 1, I'm going to read from verses 3 onwards to verse 8. So here we go. 2 Peter 1, 3 to 8. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they'll keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. You know, when I read that, sometimes we can read that and think, this is kind of like a spiritual life hack. It's like a get spiritually lean fast in 9 easy steps by Peter, right? And I think what Peter is proposing here is more than just habit stacking. If you know what habit stacking means, I don't know if you've ever come across this concept. It comes from a book called Atomic Habits by a guy called James Clear. And it's the idea that when you've established habits already, you can start stacking more onto those. So you pour your morning coffee, that's a habit you have, then you're going to pray for 5 minutes once you've done that. Once you've prayed for 5 minutes, then you can do 10 push-ups. Because and then after you've done 10 push-ups, you do the sit-ups, and it goes on, right? I just saved you having to buy that book, by the way, because that's I just saved you £10, thank me later. Which is a great idea, it makes sense. I don't think that's what Peter's proposing here. I think Peter's point is that Christians can easily get stuck. We can get stuck in our faith. And when we get stuck, actually we start sinking and shrinking. Because when you get stuck and you're not moving forwards and having qualities in increasing measure, the forces around us start pulling us backwards. And so I think Peter's point is it's essential as a Christian that you're moving forwards with momentum. And that you don't allow yourself to become stuck. You know, I think one of the things that's scandalous about Christianity is that God saves us and he gives us everything we need to live a godly life. He gives us this incredible gift, this incredible reward, and that is given regardless of your efforts, regardless of your goodness. You did not need to submit your CV in order to receive that. There was no theory or practical test required in order for you to receive salvation, right? No exam results needed. And it's scandalous because it runs up against everything we've come to know as human beings, in that the reward should be given to those who work the hardest, right? That's what makes sense to us as humans. You work hard, you should be the ones who deserve the reward. And God says no. That's not how it works over here. All other religions work that way. You do this, you follow these steps, you'll get the reward, right? And in Christianity, God says, that's not how it's going to work. I'm giving this to you regardless of your goodness. In fact, I'm giving this to you even though I know that you are sinful and you don't deserve it. I'm accomplishing this for you. This is my work. This is my gift. And Peter says, for this very reason, for what very reason? Because God has done that. Because God became a man, came down to earth in his glory and by his goodness, died for you and rose again and gave you eternal life and gave you a relationship with him. For that very reason, make every effort to add to your faith. That's a good reason to make some effort, right? Not a little bit of effort, not the occasional effort. Make every effort. In the NASB translation, it says applying all diligence. It can also mean with haste or with earnestness. You know, when God brought the Israelites out of slavery, multi-generational slavery to a corrupt and evil regime, Egypt, why did he do it? Was it because he had seen the goodness of the Israelites? Was it because they deserved it and he felt, right, you've done enough good works now, I think I'm going to act? What does God say to Moses in Exodus 3? I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. That's why God saves the Israelites. It's out of his concern, out of his love for his people. It's not because he felt like they were doing a good job in Egypt. They're not resisting the culture around them. God came in because he had heard enough suffering and he wanted to act. And what happens? They come out of Egypt, they witness miracles, they see Pharaoh being humbled, they see the plagues, they see the entire Egyptian army being engulfed by waves. They couldn't do that by their own strength. They couldn't do that. And yet on the other side of all of that, they still had to make every effort to live according to God's ways, right? And there's this saying, you can take the Israelites out of Egypt, but can you take the Egypt out of the Israelites? It's another question, right? They then had to learn how to live not according to Egypt's ways anymore, but according to God's ways. This God who had revealed himself to Moses. Just because they walked through a dry seabed doesn't mean they were automatically like the God who enabled that to happen, right? You as a Christian here today, just because you got baptized doesn't mean you automatically became exactly like Jesus, right? We know that. We know that to be the case. But I think we get confused because we know that salvation is not by works. We know it was because of God's love for us, which we didn't deserve. But I think the journey of becoming like God, sometimes we think that that's just going to happen on autopilot. We think that I'm just going to become like Christ because I'm a Christian now. And sometimes we forget Peter's message over here, that actually it's going to take effort. It's going to take intentional effort. I think we understand this in the world, right? We know this in our careers. We're going to put in a lot of effort if we want to do well in our career or in our business or at school. But when it comes to our walk with God, if I just show up to church, if I just open my Bible, if I just give a little bit financially, if I just kind of do the bare minimum, I'm going to become like Jesus. And I think we can get a little bit deceived. And I think Peter is trying to address that. The journey of becoming like Christ is an intentional one, because we are actually all being formed by the world around us. Whether we know it or not, we're being formed by media, we're being formed by movies, we're being formed by the culture around us, by our schools, by our workplaces, right? And it takes an intentional practice in community together to be like Christ. That's what we want. As a Christian, as a follower of Christ, we want to be in a relationship with Jesus. We want to be changed and become like him, and we want to do as he did. That's what it means. That's what we signed up for. If you're a Christian here today, that's what we want, right? That's what we signed up for. We want to be in relationship with God. We want to be in relationship with Jesus. We want to be like him, become like him, and do as he did. Absolutely. So, this is what we're going to be learning this year. Add to your faith. We're going to kind of split the year into 3 sections. And the first part is going to be adding to our faith knowledge. I'm going to explain that today. What does that mean? It's who God is and how we relate to him. And in the middle part of the year, we're going to be learning about practices. The spiritual practices are how we actually become like Jesus. Intentional spiritual practices are what help us to become like Christ. We're going to learn about spiritual practice. Some of these are ancient spiritual practices. Some of these are very biblical practices. We're going to try and learn new things about how to become like Jesus together in community. And finally, we're going to add love to our faith. We're going to start trying to practice being like Christ more. That might look like different things, but we're going to practice and learn about how we add love to our faith, how we show up in the world as Christians, right? Okay, so adding knowledge. The title, and I'm only just getting into my sermon now. I apologize. That was a lengthy introduction. Don't worry. We're gonna buckle yourselves in. We're going for a ride. We're gonna move a little bit more quickly now. But the search for God, adding to our faith knowledge. We're at a very interesting time in the history of knowledge. We're at a very interesting time in the history of knowledge, in that we have never known more than we do now, and yet not know what to do with all the knowledge that we have. Am I right? Like, I know so many things that I have no idea what to do with these things that I know. Are you with me? Do you guys feel that way? We know everything. We do, because we have in our pockets access to AI and the internet. You know, I was looking at this, I was having a conversation with my family recently. We were talking about how not that long ago, people didn't really know much, right? And if you look at literacy rates in England, you know, prior to like the 1900s, if you look in the 1800s, more than half of the people couldn't read, right? And if you go back in time, obviously it drops further and further. You know, in the 17th, 18th century, 5 to 10% of the English population could read. And obviously in the 1900s, we saw that rocket. For the first time, only in the 1900s, literacy rates approached 90% plus. Wow. If you think about fast forward 100 years, from being able to, like the population being able to read, to the advent of the internet, and now AI just 20 years after, 25 years after the advent of the internet, it's incredible to see the pace at which information and knowledge is being shared. If you think about literacy as kind of the earliest signs of the ability to share information, right? Because if you couldn't read, you could not really gather information unless someone sat down with you and explained to you things, right? So think about life in the 1800s. You only knew what you needed to know to survive, right? So if you needed to farm, you probably knew quite a lot about farming, but that was it, right? You didn't have all this other ideas and information about the world and about psychology and about business and the economy and leadership. And you didn't know that because you didn't need to know that. And you had no way of accessing that. There were no leadership conferences and psychology conferences in the 1800s, right? But we know so much now. Come on, teacher. We know so much now. And with the explosion of AI, we are now able to access this information in such a sophisticated way that we can have a human being speak it to us as if we're having a conversation with a human, and it is actually more sophisticated now than a human being trying to teach us, because it learns the way that I actually enjoy learning. And so it feeds things to me in a way that makes sense for me. I ask AI questions now that are not even spiritual, and it will start throwing in spiritual content in there because it knows I like spiritual stuff. Oh, thanks, ChatGPT. I didn't need that verse, but I'll take it. It helps. It helps. You know, I was reading something really interesting by the head of Instagram. This is the CEO of Instagram, and he was making comments on social media and how it's changing. And he was saying something along the lines of, you know, now with AI, you know, what made social media really meaningful and important was that you could kind of have a voice and you could share sort of your voice online and people could hear you and know who you are, right? But now with AI, the ability to be real and to connect and have a voice that couldn't be faked is no longer the case, because now you can actually fake that voice with AI tools, with the right tools. And what he's basically saying is that people will become more and more focused on rawness and realness and imperfection, as opposed to being polished and being perfect and being, being too polished. And what he says, in a world where everything can be perfected, imperfection becomes a signal. Rawness isn't just aesthetic preference anymore. It's proof, a way of saying, this is real because it's imperfect. So what you'll see more and more of is not the polished Instagram reels, but it's the blurry, kind of messy real life, because actually with AI now, that's actually what will distinguish you from a computer tool. It's the ability to actually just be authentic, to be unpolished, to be messy, and to be yourself. And I was thinking about that. I was like, what am I learning about that? What I get from that is that what people are looking for is not just information. They're looking for connection. They're looking for relationship. They care less about what you know. They might want to know how much you care. They might want to know what makes you you. What makes you imperfect. What do you have that resonates with me? And that makes sense to me. You know, even my son who's 6, Oliver, He asks me loads of questions, and oftentimes I can't answer these questions. So I am like ChatGPT to him, to what AI is to me. And he asks me, what's inside a leaf? And I'm like, I've heard of like chlorophyll. I think is it chlorophyll inside a leaf? I'm asking this. I'm not a scientist. What's inside the moon? My initial thought was just cheese, but I didn't want to tell him that. But what he's looking for from me is not just the information. He cares about what I think because I'm his dad. He wants to know because he finds it interesting what I think. Even for a speaker at church now, does it really matter how deep an insight I can give you? Because you can go on AI and you can punch in things about the scriptures and it will pull out more interesting things than I can say. Actually, let me give myself a bit more credit. It'll pull out as interesting things as I can say. I don't want to discourage myself at the start of the year.
Come on, TJ.
I want to believe in myself a little bit.
Believe in God.
But that's the thing, right? There's so much amazing information now. What really matters, I guess, is rawness, is being real, is the ability for us to have a relationship and for you to know me and for me to know you, because AI can't do that, right? So what does it mean to add to your faith knowledge? We're coming back here now to what we're talking about. I think the Bible reveals an insight that we're learning now with the explosion of AI, which is that there's a difference between information dissemination and relational knowledge. In other words, there's a difference between knowing about someone and really knowing someone, right? And it's very obvious. I know that sounds very obvious, but we're starting to see that play out, online. In the New Testament, there's two words that are used for knowledge in the Greek. The first is gnosis, right? Gnosis. And it's used about 30 times in the New Testament. Jesus uses it twice, one of which is here in Luke 11, where he says, "Woe to you experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to gnosis, to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering." Wow. Paul uses it many times. Romans 11, he says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom of the knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out." And in Romans 15, "I myself am convinced, brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with knowledge, and competent to instruct one another." 1 Corinthians 1, "For in him you have been enriched in every way with all kinds of speech and with all knowledge." Knowledge, gnosis, is presented as something incredibly valuable, if not essential, to entering the kingdom, to having a relationship with God. It's this idea that you've come to understand the mystery, that you've grasped the nature of who God is. It's not just academic, I don't think. It has to do with the right grasping and understanding of who God is.
Yes, you're right.
Who God is. But there's a second type of Greek word for knowing, and it appears much more frequently in the New Testament. Some of you may already know this. It's the word ginōskō in the Greek. And it's the word that comes from the Hebrew yada. This is the translation of that word in Greek. "I know my sheep, and my sheep know me," in John 10. Galatians 4, Paul says, "Now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God." What does this word what does this word really mean? It's not just knowing in terms of having the right understanding. It's a loyalty. It's a covenant. It's a personal intimacy. It's knowledge not just by information, it's knowing by participation, by encounter. One of my favorite usages of this word, which I think reveals a lot about this point, is in Matthew 7. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Jesus says, I never gnosko you. I never knew you. He doesn't say, I knew you once, but you fell away. Or I don't recognize you. Or you did the wrong things. I never knew you. Jesus wants to know us. He knows everything there is to know about you already, right? He knows the number of hairs that are on your head, which for some of the men here like myself is getting easier and easier as the years go by. He knows the data about you, but he wants to know you. He wants to have a personal relationship. He wants to experience you. He wants to encounter you. He wants to participate with you. And he wants you to participate with him. Tim Keller has this concept that what puts people off Christianity is not because they find it hard to believe it, it's that it's too personal. It's too personal a religion. A God that becomes this personal, that he wants to encounter you. He wants to put his spirit inside of you. He wants to know you in a way that perhaps we also sometimes don't always want to be known, right? Sometimes we have a fear of being known in that way. How do we know if we're allowing ourselves to be known by Jesus? Well, I think when we look at this passage, we need to be able to prioritize a relationship over reward. You know, it seems like what these well-intentioned followers of Jesus were looking for was reward. They wanted the reward of people's praise for them. They wanted the reward of having the power, but they were less concerned about the connection and relationship with Jesus, right? And I think we need to ask ourselves, is my posture with God one of the reward is the relationship, my reward is God, or is it God, you are here so that I can find my reward, right? One of the earliest appearances of God in the Bible, a story that I like going back to. God does appear before this, but if you like the first tangible physical appearance of God, Exodus 3. How does God appear in the story of Exodus 3? A burning bush, right? And, we can read this in, let's go to Exodus 3. And let's just read. Okay. Exodus 3, I'll just read the first few verses. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. Why does this bush not burn up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. You know, God does appear to Abraham prior to this, but he doesn't appear as any recognizable description of any sort, nor does he give himself a name. Why does God come as a burning bush? I have no idea. You'll have to ask God that yourself. But what's interesting about it is that he appears as something that he's created. He appears in nature, but he also appears as something that goes against the laws of nature, right? He appears in nature and he appears as something that goes against the law of nature. It's natural, but it's also unnatural, right? A burning bush should do what it says on the tin. It should just burn up, right? And that's actually what intrigues Moses. Moses actually desires to go closer to this burning bush. God sees that and speaks to him. I find that interesting. It says that when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, he calls to him from within the bush. You know, sometimes we can be initially very afraid of approaching God, right? God comes down as fire. Fire is not something that you want to play with. Fire burns. It's going to hurt. But it also draws Moses straight in. You know, God comes as a burning bush. A burning bush is something that you don't expect to see. It's scary. If you like, it's a paradigm bomb. It breaks up your paradigm of what should be and what makes sense. And it allows you to redefine the world around this aberration of nature. Because that should not happen. And because that's happening, I need to now listen and figure out what this world means and who I am as a result. That's what's happening here. And Moses actually goes from hiding his face in fear to then having a conversation with God and being basically hired to do a job with God, right? Fear to partnership. It's amazing, this conversation that Moses has. And what is the name that God gives himself? This is where he says, I've heard the misery and the crying of Israel. And then he says, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, that I am has sent you. I am who I am. Not, I am whoever you want me to be, Moses. Or I am whatever I feel like on a given day. I am who I am. Take off your sandals because you're now on holy ground. You know, if you want to have a relationship with God, you need to have that relationship on his terms, not on your own. Right? Moses was struggling a little bit with this because if you look at the conversation, he basically tries to change God's plan by saying that I'm not the guy, I can't speak properly, I'm not the person, find someone else. And actually God is not very pleased with that. And he says, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight? Who makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and teach what you are to say. You know, sometimes when we approach God, we want him to be a lump of clay, not a burning bush. We want to take him, we want to make him and fashion him into something that works for us. And we would rather him not be the burning bush that speaks to us. We would rather keep our sandals on and play with the clay than take our sandals off and bow before the burning bush. I lived my life that way. When I was growing up, I thought I was a Christian. I grew up with a Christian faith, and I assumed that I could have my faith on the side and I could make God into who I want him to be, and I can go after the things that I really want in life. I want to be successful. I want to have a beautiful girlfriend and a beautiful wife. I want to have this kind of lifestyle. I want to be able to travel here and there. And I went to God defining what I think I should be and what my life should look like and trying to fit God into that. This is not a God who you can fit into your life. This is a God who calls us to fit into his, right? You know, I was trying to write my own story. I wanted to define who I was as the central character, as the protagonist, as the hero, rather than make God the author of the story and allow me to be his character and let him decide who I want to be. Do you have that time in your life where you remember encountering the burning bush, where your paradigm of what you thought you should be and life should be like was burnt up, and then you allowed yourself to be redefined by who God is? You know, we cannot allow Jesus to know us, to ginōskō us, if we are constantly trying to define who we think we are and what our life should be like, and God be an accessory to the side of that, right? We need to take off our shoes, approach the burning bush, and allow God to speak to us and define who he thinks we should be and what this relationship should look like. You know, I want to end with a story with Jesus here. You know, in John chapter 8, Jesus is having a long argument with the Pharisees. They were trying to mold him into who they wanted him to be for their agenda. And what were they saying? They were saying, aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed? Jesus, can't you just admit that this is who you are? Because this is what we think you are. We think you're a Samaritan. We hate Samaritans. We think you're demon-possessed. We hate demons and demon-possessed people, right? They wanted to mold Jesus into an object that they could destroy. Doesn't the world often do that with people, by the way? Don't we often try to mold people into who we think they should be so that we can fit them into our agenda?
Come on, TJ.
Look at what Jesus says in verses 54 onwards in John chapter 8. If I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him and obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. And then they question him again, and he says, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. I am who I am. A direct callback to Exodus 3, where Moses was trying to figure out, who are you?
Come on.
Who do you say that you are? Who should I tell people that you are? I am who I am. And Jesus is using the same name before the Pharisees here. I am not who you think I am, who you want me to be, so that I fit into your agenda. Later in the book of John, Jesus will say this, I'm the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip?
Come on, TJ.
Even after I've been among you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? You know, we need to go from knowing about God to really knowing God. There's a point at which in our spiritual lives, we go from knowing about God to encountering him, to having this deeper walk with him, to learning from him, to relying on him, to working with him, to resting with him. You know, if you're early on in your spiritual life, maybe you're still at the place of gnosis, learning about God, getting the right information about who he is. And we're going to be learning a bit more about that this year as well. But for those of us who have been journeying with God, are we still meeting with the real God? Are we allowing him to be who he is in our life? Or have other priorities started to become our focus? You know, Sonia and I are approaching our 9th anniversary now in the next few days. And ever since we've been married, we've been business partners. We went into the paid ministry basically straight after our honeymoon. And it's a great joy to be able to work with your wife, and I love it, and it's such a privilege. But it's also challenging working with your spouse too, right? Every day, you know, working with your spouse can be really difficult. And, you know, it's not easy having a working marriage. Why? Because there's no such thing as a working marriage. There's just marriage, right? So it's difficult to have a working marriage because it doesn't exist. And what you have is really a marriage. And so what can be difficult is when you've got work to do as a married couple, but you don't feel united. That can be really tricky when you need to sit down and be like, we've got this meeting, we've got to work on this, we've got to plan these finances, we've got to plan this trip, and yet you don't feel connected on some level. And you know what's really hard about that? Is it's very hard to work together. That's why marriage is tough as a you know, when you work together. But you know what it reminds us of? It reminds us that marriage is, number one, a covenant relationship. It's a relationship of love. Number two, number three, involves some business and some work at times, right? Our relationship with God, number one, is a covenant relationship. That needs to be right first. We need to allow God to be God in our life and not start putting other things above that so that he fits into our agenda. Can we let God be who God is? The I am who I am. Jesus, in a way, is the voice that speaks to us from the burning bush. He's the voice that speaks to us from within the burning bush. You know, fire was associated with sacrifice. You would offer your sacrifice at the altar and it would be burned at the altar and it would cleanse you from your sin. In Isaiah 6, an angel brings a fiery coal and touches it against Isaiah's lip and it cleanses him and he encounters God for the first time. He goes from knowing about God to knowing the real God. Jesus went metaphorically into the fire for us. He was willing to endure suffering and death for us. And he speaks to us from within that suffering. He says, I love you and I will be your sacrifice for your sin so that you would find me and know me. Don't settle for knowing about Jesus. Know and encounter the real God by knowing Jesus. Encounter him in his word, in his prayer, in community. And let's add to our faith knowledge as we seek to deepen our walk with God this year. So we'll be talking a lot more about knowledge, practices, and love this year, but let's close there in a word of prayer. Let's pray.